Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's decision to quietly step back from their high-profile children's online safety initiative has sparked more questions than clarity. Because when a cause is introduced with such emotional weight and personal storytelling, people expect long-term visibility, not a silent handover. The Parents Network, launched in August 2024 under the Archewell Foundation, was framed as one of the Sussexes' most personal missions yet, focused on supporting parents who lost children to suicide linked to online harm, cyberbullying, and digital exploitation. Harry and Meghan spoke not as distant philanthropists, but as parents themselves, warning that social media has become a space where even the most attentive families can miss the signs of danger. Their interviews were raw, deliberate, and powerful, with Meghan saying all parents want is to protect their children, and Harry warning that parents are now being forced into the role of first responders without the tools to recognize silent crises. That's why the revelation that the Parents Network has now been transferred operationally to Parents Together feels jarring to many observers. Officially, this move is described as a strategic partnership, part of Archewell's long-standing model of incubating initiatives before transitioning them into independent organizations similar to Invictus and Travailist. Archewell has reportedly provided Parents Together with full operational capacity and a cash grant to fund the first year of operations, framing the decision as practical, responsible, and sustainability-focused. Yet critics argue this explanation doesn't fully address the emotional disconnect. Unlike Invictus, which has remained closely associated with Prince Harry over the years, the Parents Network was built on deeply personal narratives, grief-driven advocacy, and the Sussexes' own fears as parents navigating a digital world they openly distrust. When such a project is stepped away from so quickly, it raises doubts about whether the commitment matched the intensity of the launch. Supporters counter that real change doesn't require constant visibility, and that empowering experienced organizations like Parents Together may actually help families more than celebrity-led management ever could. Parents Together already has trusted relationships with affected families and long-standing expertise in digital child safety, making it, in theory, a logical permanent home for the initiative. Still, the timing matters. The transfer comes at a moment when Harry and Meghan's public role in philanthropy is increasingly scrutinized, with critics pointing to a broader pattern in which projects receive heavy publicity at launch but less personal involvement over time. The Sussexes' defenders say this criticism is unfair, arguing that stepping back from daily operations allows them to advocate at a higher level while experts handle execution. But royal watchers note that the couple's visibility around the Parents Network has noticeably declined since the partnership announcement in October, despite the issue being one Harry has described as urgent and escalating. The debate ultimately circles back to trust and perception. Harry and Meghan have positioned themselves as champions of emotional honesty, mental health awareness, and parental protection, especially after stepping away from royal duties and building a brand rooted in values rather than titles. When an initiative tied so closely to those values is handed off, the public naturally wonders whether the Sussexes are redefining leadership or quietly disengaging. What complicates matters further is the couple's repeated emphasis on urgency, that children are being harmed now, that parents are unprepared now, that the digital environment is evolving faster than safeguards. In that context, any reduction in personal involvement feels amplified. Yet it is also true that sustainable change often happens away from cameras, within systems that don't require celebrity faces attached at every step. Whether this move strengthens the Parents Network or weakens public confidence in the Sussexes' long-term advocacy remains to be seen. For now, the story sits in an uncomfortable middle ground, where intentions, execution, and perception collide, leaving audiences to decide whether this was a responsible evolution of a serious initiative or another example of a cause that burned bright in the spotlight before being quietly passed on. What makes this development even more complex is the broader context in which Harry and Meghan now operate, because unlike traditional royals, their influence depends heavily on perception, consistency, and public trust rather than institutional permanence. Since stepping back from royal duties, every initiative they attach their names to is viewed not just as charity work, but as a reflection of their post-royal identity and credibility. The parents' network was different from other projects because it wasn't framed as symbolic or aspirational. It was framed as urgent, emotional, and deeply personal, rooted in conversations with grieving parents and framed around real-life consequences of digital harm. That emotional framing created an implicit promise that this wasn't a short-term campaign, but a long-term fight. When leadership shifts so quickly, even for strategic reasons, audiences begin to question whether the Sussexes underestimated the scale of the challenge or overestimated their ability to stay directly involved. There is also the uncomfortable reality that advocacy around children and online harm demands sustained pressure on governments, tech companies, and regulators. Work that is slow, frustrating, and largely invisible. It lacks the immediate emotional payoff of interviews and launch events, and it requires years of persistence to yield measurable change. Supporters argue that this is precisely why transferring the initiative to Parents Together makes sense. Because real progress often comes from organizations embedded in policy battles rather than public figures navigating media storms. Still, critics point out that Harry and Meghan built momentum by putting their faces, voices, and personal fears at the center of the campaign. And stepping back risks deflating that momentum at a time when digital harm to children is accelerating, not slowing. The couple's own words now echo back at them, particularly Harry's warning that parents are being forced into emergency roles without training, and Meghan's insistence that protecting children online requires active, ongoing involvement. In that light, silence feels louder than intention. This moment also feeds into a larger narrative surrounding the Sussexes, where actions are often interpreted through the lens of past departures, transitions, and unfinished chapters. Fair or not, the public has become conditioned to watch for patterns, and any handover invites comparison to previous projects that critics claim faded from focus over time. Yet it is also possible that this transition marks a quieter, more mature phase of their advocacy, one less dependent on headlines and more focused on outcomes. The truth likely sits somewhere between disappointment and pragmatism, where good intentions meet the limits of time, attention, and influence. Whether the parents' network ultimately thrives under Parents Together or fades into obscurity will determine how this chapter is remembered. Not just for the families it aimed to support, but for what it reveals about how Harry and Meghan choose to lead when the spotlight moves on.